first off, thanks again for the invitation. We're going to, review the soybean market, kind of where we are right now. This is my contact information. If you do think of some questions later on, please let me know. I'd be happy to try and answer those, but I do have a pretty heavy travel schedule, so I will get back to you as soon as I can. Again, this is kind of a busy time of year for everybody. So let's begin. I usually like to start with the information from USDA. The reason I do that is when you listen to the radio or you read some reports in the news, the ag news, a lot of times they'll say, well, USDA reported this, and here's why I, as an analyst, think that number is correct or incorrect, or what adjustments have to be made. So I usually like to try and start, because that is the USDA information is the starting point for our discussion. Now, today I don't have time to go through all of these. I usually just kind of hit the highlights. So a couple things that we've noted, kind of looking back a little bit on the information we got from the last USDA report. The first, we have to realize that based on the numbers we got, and these will be the final official numbers for total production, we did have a record soybean production year. So this is the largest soybean crop the U.S. has produced so far in history. Most of that is because of a higher yields, slightly increase in yields, but we also had pretty good planted acreage. So even though we are looking at some very strong prices right now, you have to realize that, again, this was the largest soybean crop in history, which means or suggests that we have also some very strong demand base. So let's look right now for old crop soybeans, as well as leading into new crop. We're looking at how quickly are we using up our inventories, our available supplies. So provide some historical perspective. The blue line on the top is crushing, the amount of soybeans that go into the crushing sector. The red line is the amount for exports. The little dotted lines on the far right-hand side are the current USDA estimates. So let's compare the current estimates with some historical perspective. Looking at the blue line first, USDA is forecasting a slight increase in crushing demand. I agree with that number, mainly because right now the profit margins for crushing are very, very strong. We've had a rebound or recovery in soybean oil prices, primarily driven by the interest in renewable diesel fuel. I don't have time again to go through the details of that, but because of strong demand for meal, not only domestically, but internationally, as well as now an increase in soybean oil prices due to the use in the renewable diesel industry, even though it's small, it's growing. The crush plants right now are basically running at full capacity. So that is really the physical limit of our ability to crush soybeans right now. Granted, there's going to be a new plant coming up in Spiritwood in about 18 months or so. That will add to our crush capacity, but right now we're pretty much running wide open. So I don't disagree with that number at all. The next number, which is the exports number, last year was a record soybean export year. So last year's number was a record export season. USDA is forecasting a slight reduction from that record level. Again, right now, based on what we see, I agree with that forecast. So I know this is a very busy table. I only want to focus on a few numbers. So all of the numbers on this table, with the exception of the column on the far right-hand side, this last column on the far right is different. Everything else on this table are 12-month totals for exports. So how much grain do we ship to specific countries? Notice last year was a record year. Our previous record was in 2016. The column on the far right-hand side is the exports we have made to date. So starting on September 1, running through the middle of January, which is the most recent information we have, this is what we have been able to sell so far this season. Now notice the totals are actually pretty strong. China, being our largest customer, again, has been relatively aggressive in their purchases so far this year. We also sell a considerable amount of soybeans to Mexico, as well as the European Union, for crushing. But everybody is obviously focusing on China and their purchases. Now, if we look at total purchases so far, now these are actually shipments, how much has been actually loaded onto a vessel and left the country. The red line is where we are right now. That's the most recent information we have. The black line is what we saw last year, and the green line is what we saw the previous record year. So let's compare, let's ignore kind of what happened during our trade war years versus what's happening now today. So we started out our export season very aggressively. Now we normally have a seasonal pattern for exports. Right after harvest, we tend to ship a lot of soybeans out of the country. And then by the time we get into this January, February time period, our exports start to drop off as the Brazilians start to harvest their crop. So the world comes to us during our harvest season. And then once the Brazilians kick in and their harvest starts, that's when the world starts to shift to buying Brazilian soybeans. Notice now last year, our record year, our export season lasted a little longer than normal and then dropped up pretty quickly. The reason that is because last year, Brazil had delayed planting. It was kind of dry, so they delayed their planting season. Planting was kind of slow progress, which meant that our export season actually lasted a little longer than normal. Well, this year, the opposite happened. Brazil planted their crop earlier than normal, and they had very rapid planting progress. They are now harvesting their soybeans. So the soybean harvest in northern Brazil in that Mato Grosso region has already started. And we are getting some reports now. This morning, there were some reports that there's some shipping delays. There's kind of some problems getting vessels into their ports, loaded and turned around. So again, we'll have to watch kind of what's going on very closely. And I do think that's one of the reasons that last week we saw a slight rebound in our export shipments, is because we're starting to see some of those concerns about not only the size of the South American crop, in particular Brazil, but also some of the timing differences start to appear in our marketplace. So I do expect to see a reduction, a lower total export season, but we're going to have to watch pretty closely in the next several weeks on how many sales have we gotten and what is the shipping pace. So again, depending upon how quickly the Brazilians can harvest, get those beans to a port facility to be loaded onto a vessel, it will potentially have an impact on our ability to sell in the international market. So who exports soybeans? I just want to give you a perspective. The two biggest exporters for whole soybeans are the United States, which is in green, and Brazil, which is in blue. The number one buyer of soybeans in the global market is China. So the red line is the amount that China imports off the global market. The point in showing this is recognize the growth rate historically we've seen in Chinese purchases, and now kind of that flattening out where instead of this nice steady growth, we had a reduction a couple of years ago because of African swine fever. The Chinese have started rebuilding their hog herd, but have not really gotten back to the full capacity. And so we're now seeing kind of a flattening out or a stabilizing of the amount of soybeans China needs to import. But at the same time, we're seeing some very strong export potential out of Brazil as well as the United States. So when we look at the supply side in the international market versus the demand side, demand is flattening out even though the supply continues to grow. So longer term, as we move into 2022, we start talking about how many acres of soybeans versus corn versus wheat do we need in the United States. This will all start to play into that discussion and that conversation. So what's happening right now in South America? Let's talk about Brazil first. This is a map of where Brazil produces soybeans. So the deeper the green, the darker the green, the more soybeans are produced. Notice we always talk about this Mato Grosso region, which is in the north. It's a very large region, has about 25% of typically of the production. But we also have down in the southern region, a couple of very large producing zones as well. So Paraná, as well as Rio Grande do Sul, those two states, if you add them together, are about 30% of the production. So when we look at soil moisture conditions, the crop development and the amount of soil moisture conditions, this is a map that was put together by NASA, okay? And it shows the soil moisture conditions in the top meter of soil, about the top 3 feet. Consider that like the root zone, okay? I've tried to draw a triangle over the area where most of the soybeans in Brazil are grown. The reason, now this is not a drought monitor map like in the US. Drought monitor map goes deep into the soil profile. This is just kind of that surface moisture. So we've seen some very dry conditions in southern Brazil as well as Argentina, and it is impacting yield and yield potential. This is an NDVI map. So this is like a vegetative index, and it's the percent of normal. So this is satellite imagery. We're taking a photo and trying to determine how green is the crop. And so this map shows the greenness today for the week of January 17th through the 24th relative to that time of year when versus normal. So how do we stack up today relative to what we would normally see at this time of year? So if it's in green, it means that it's above average, that it looks healthier. The crop looks healthier than typical. If it's in the brown, it's lower than normal. Okay, now up here is Mato Grosso. Down here there's Paraná. Here is Rio Grande do Sul. Notice that the southern growing regions have below average crop health. The northern region is average to slightly above average. So northern Brazil this year is going to have very good yield and yield potential. The problem has been in this southern region. Now, they're harvesting in the north. They haven't started harvesting in the south, so we don't have any really good yield reports yet. We're starting to take some of the yield potential and total production out of the Brazilian crop because of these problems down here in the south. When we look at Argentina, actually Argentina has had more problems than Brazil. Their growing region's a little smaller, a bit more concentrated. Again, the darker the green, the more bushels are produced. So if we look at soil moisture conditions, again, it's been very dry for quite a while. We look at the soil health the crop health conditions, again, below average. What's happened more recently now, late last week and into this week, Argentina has been getting some rains. So the Argentina crop is really in that flowering and pod set development stage. So about like our August. So some rains right now could at least stabilize the yield potential coming out of Argentina, which again would be really important because the soybean market today is watching those numbers very closely. So if USDA is right, I think if the crushing demand will be about right, we'll have to wait to see on exports. But if USDA is correct, we will start to rebuild some of our inventories of soybeans. Instead of looking at total bushels, I like to look at it as a percentage. So let's focus on these blue bars in the bottom. That's the stocks to use ratio. It's scaled over here on the right-hand side. So we're taking our ending stocks divided by total use. So what percent of our total needs do we have in reserve in case there's a problem next year? And that's important because two things happen when we have very, very tight supplies. So if we look back into this 2012, 2013 timeframe when our inventories were very small, we tend to have higher average prices for soybeans and a lot more price volatility because there isn't much margin for error. So any new piece of information tends to either cause prices to spike higher or take some pressure off of the markets and we see lower prices. So we tend to get a lot of volatility. Obviously, back here in the trade war, when we had the trade war with China, we had very large inventories. We've been able to bring those inventories down. So let's look at the red bar right now, which is the current USDA forecast relative to history. The reason, again, I want to point to this is what does that mean for average prices and price volatility moving into the rest of this growing season? And more importantly, how many acres of soybeans do we really need to have in 2022? Because we're now going to start this discussion about the balance of acres and how many acres do we really need. So let's look at the volatility of old crop prices, the crop prices for soybeans in the bin versus new crop. We got two very different stories going on. So this is the price chart. I pulled this at about 9:30 this morning. So about, hour and a half ago. And you can see during the summer months when we're a lot of uncertainty about what how many acres are going to be planted, with the yield potential. We had a lot of volatility in prices. As we got into this growing season, and in particular into harvest, we saw prices drop and start to stabilize. Now, with some of the problems we're seeing in South America and concerns about the size of the South American crop, we've seen some of the rally come back into the soybean market, especially for old crop. Okay, now as we look at new crop, the patterns are different. We see some volatility back here. So this would be for November soybeans. That's the futures month we use for contracting harvest delivery soybeans. So if you're trying to think about forward selling some soybeans, this is the contract month that the elevator is going to use. Notice here, last week, we actually had the contract high for November soybeans. Okay, now we've seen a slight reduction over the last several days because of some rains again in Argentina. So as we move forward, there's two things that are going to be impacting both old crop and new crop prices. Number one, how big is that South American crop? And number two, will China come in and buy some more US beans to kind of backfill some of what they were expecting to have out of Brazil and South America, Brazil and Argentina? Or will they make the switch and start buying some more Brazilian beans? Those are the two key things right now, short term, that the market's looking at. I do think there will be kind of a battle for acres, but it's going to be more of a balancing act.